A German fighter pilot spared a crippled American bomber high above Germany. 10 men lived because of that choice. Then both pilots went home and never spoke of it again. For 43 years, Charlie Brown carried one question. Who was he, the German pilot who looked him in the eyes and chose mercy instead of murder? The man who risked execution to save strangers? What follows is the story of how two enemies became brothers, a story not of bullets and blood, but of compassion in a time of cruelty. The winter of 1943 hung over Germany like a heavy shroud. The sky was the color of cold steel, and the air bit through fabric and flesh alike. High above the cloud layer, engines thundered. The deep, rhythmic growl of war machines locked in deadly purpose. On that bitter December day, one crippled American bomber limped through the frozen heavens, bleeding smoke and oil, its body torn open by German flak. Inside, the crew of 10 fought against time, blood loss, and gravity. Their aircraft, a B-17 flying fortress known as Ye Old Pub, had taken a savage beating. Holes gaped in its fuselage wide enough to crawl through. One engine was gone, another barely hanging on. The tail gunner was dead, and most of the others were wounded, some drifting in and out of consciousness. The intercom was shattered. The temperature inside dropped so low that the men's oxygen masks froze against their faces. Still, their pilot, a 21-year-old West Virginian named Charlie Brown, kept his trembling hands on the controls, determined to bring his men home. Moments earlier, they'd been deep in enemy territory near Bremen, their mission to bomb a factory that supplied the German war machine. They had succeeded, but the cost was almost fatal. German anti-aircraft batteries had torn into them. Fighters had swarmed the straggler formation like hawks upon a wounded bird. Somehow, against the odds, Brown's bomber had survived the onslaught long enough to break away, limping westward toward the North Sea and the promise of home. But the Luftwaffe wasn't finished. Out of the cloud layer, a Messerschmitt Bf-109 emerged, sleek, predatory, and very much alive. Its nose gun shimmered with frost. Its propeller blades spun like a saw of death. Inside sat Franz Stigler, a German ace with more than 20 victories to his name. He was returning to base, his ammunition nearly spent, when he spotted the wounded B-17 crawling toward the sea. Through his gun sight, the bomber was an easy kill, a victory that would push him closer to the Knight's Cross, the highest honor a Luftwaffe pilot could earn. Yet as Franz closed in, he saw something that made his finger hesitate on the trigger. Through the shattered rear section, he could see men inside the American plane tending to each other, one holding pressure to a wound, another trying to help a dying comrade. The tail gunner lay motionless, his blood frozen to the metal of his turret. The bomber's guns hung limp, useless. These men weren't fighting anymore. They were simply trying to live. Franz's mind flashed back to his own past. His brother August, killed earlier in the war, shot down in flames. He remembered his commanding officer, Gustav Rodel, who once told him, "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. You fight with honor, or you die without it." That code of honor burned in Franz's chest as he pulled alongside the American bomber. Inside Ye Old Pub, Charlie Brown saw the German fighter appear on his wing and froze. He'd expected this, the final strike that would finish them off. His hand reached instinctively for the control column, ready to try one last desperate maneuver. But the German didn't fire. Instead, the Messerschmitt stayed beside them, matching their speed, the pilot looking directly at Charlie through the canopy. For a long moment, two enemies, two young men raised to hate each other, locked eyes in the thin, freezing air. Charlie's bomber staggered onward, every second a miracle. Franz could have ended it at any moment. Instead, he motioned, first pointing down, signaling for the Americans to land in Germany. Charlie shook his head weakly. His mission was clear: get home or die trying. Realizing the Americans would not surrender, Franz did something unthinkable. He positioned his fighter to protect the bomber from German anti-aircraft gunners below, escorting them through the deadly airspace toward the North Sea. Any ground officer who saw this might report him for treason. If his superiors discovered the truth, Franz could face a firing squad. But he didn't care. When they reached open water, Franz gave one final salute, a slow, deliberate gesture of respect, then peeled his fighter away and vanished into the clouds. Charlie Brown's battered B-17 somehow made it back across the channel, landing at RAF Seething in England. The crew that stumbled out of the wreck looked like ghosts, pale, frostbitten, bloodied. Of the 11 men aboard, one was dead, the rest wounded. The ground crew who examined Ye Old Pub were astonished. The bomber was so shredded it should never have stayed in the air. Its tail section was barely attached. The control cables were frayed to threads. One mechanic swore it was flying on a prayer and a miracle. During debriefing, Charlie reported what had happened. His superiors listened in silence as he described the German fighter that had spared them, the escort through German territory, the salute. When he finished, the intelligence officer leaned forward and said coldly, "Lieutenant, you will never speak of this again." The reason was simple. Mercy didn't fit the war narrative. If word spread that German pilots could show compassion, it might soften the hatred that kept men fighting. Officially, such an act had never happened. The Luftwaffe was the enemy, and enemies couldn't be human. Charlie obeyed. He didn't even tell his crew the full story. The war raged on. Charlie Brown completed his combat tour, flew more missions, and watched friends fall from the sky. By 1945, the world was in ruins, and men like him had aged decades in just a few years. When peace finally came, he went home to West Virginia, where the forests were quiet and the skies no longer burned. He tried to build a normal life. He went to college, married, and later rejoined the newly formed U.S. Air Force in 1949. His service took him across the world, to Europe, to Asia, even to the jungles of Vietnam as a State Department Foreign Service officer. From the outside, he looked like a man who had made peace with his past, but at night, the war returned. His daughter would later recall waking to the sound of her father's cries. Charlie's nightmares were always the same: the bomber, the flak, the dying men, and the German pilot who appeared out of nowhere, who could have killed them but didn't. He never forgot those eyes through the canopy. Somewhere, he believed, that man was still alive. On the other side of the world, Franz Stigler also survived the war. When Germany collapsed in 1945, he narrowly escaped death as Allied forces swept through the wreckage of the Luftwaffe. He lost everything: his squadron, his homeland, and the nation he once swore to defend. In 1953, he immigrated to Canada, settling in Vancouver. He started a small business, married, and built a quiet life among the pines and mountains. But he, too, carried ghosts. He rarely spoke of his service. The war had left him hollow. He'd lost his brother, watched countless comrades die, and witnessed his country consumed by madness. And beneath all that, one memory stayed sharp: the American bomber riddled with holes, drifting like a dying bird, and the young pilot who refused to give up. That moment had changed Franz forever. He stopped chasing glory. He no longer cared for medals or victory counts. After that day, he would later say, I couldn't shoot at another man just trying to live. For both men, the war had ended, but its echo never did. By the mid-1980s, the world had changed. The Cold War was thawing, and old soldiers were gathering once more, not in battle but in memory. The war that had defined their youth had become history, a fading chapter in textbooks. But for Charlie Brown, now 64 and retired in Miami, history wasn't something in books. It was something that woke him up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat. In 1986, he received an invitation from Boeing to attend a reunion of combat pilots in Boston, an event called the Gathering of Eagles, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the first flight of the B-17 Flying Fortress. Hundreds of veterans arrived, gray-haired men in worn leather jackets, their eyes still carrying the weight of skies they'd once ruled. During a round-table discussion, someone asked if any pilot in the room had ever experienced a mission they could never forget. Charlie sat silently for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, he began to speak, hesitantly at first. He told them about that December day over Germany, the mission gone wrong, the dying crew, and the lone German fighter that appeared on their wing. He spoke of the salute, that small, impossible act of mercy in a world that had forgotten what mercy looked like. When he finished, the room was quiet. A few men leaned forward, eyes wide. Then someone asked, "Did you ever find out who he was?" Charlie shook his head. "No," he said softly. "I never did." That question, so simple, reignited the spark he'd buried for 43 years. Who was that man? Did he survive the war? Why had he spared them? When Charlie returned to Miami, he couldn't let it rest. His wife noticed it immediately. The way he stared off at nothing, the sudden phone calls, the boxes of documents spreading across their living room floor. The search had begun. He started with the U.S. Air Force Historical Office, then contacted the West German Air Force Archives. He wrote letters, dozens, then hundreds, describing the encounter in detail, the date, the region, the damaged bomber, and the escort to safety. Surely someone must have known a Luftwaffe pilot who refused to finish off a crippled B-17 near Bremen on December 20th, 1943. But the replies came back cold and formal. No record, incomplete data, files lost, destroyed by Soviet forces. Charlie hit dead end after dead end. The German records were scattered, many burned during the fall of Berlin, others locked in government vaults. Some historians told him it was hopeless, like trying to find a single snowflake after a blizzard. Still, he couldn't stop. The nightmares had returned, stronger now that the memory had been unearthed. Every night he saw the Germans' eyes again, not hateful, but human. By 1989, he changed tactics. Instead of searching through bureaucracy, he decided to reach the veterans themselves. He wrote an article for Jägerblatt, a newsletter read by former Luftwaffe pilots and combat aviators across Europe. In his letter, he described the mission in vivid detail, the crippled bomber, the escort, the salute, and his own unending gratitude. "If you were that pilot," he wrote, "or if you know who was, please contact me. You saved the lives of 10 men that day." He mailed it off, then waited. Weeks turned into months. Then one morning in January 1990, a letter arrived. Plain, white, postmarked Vancouver, Canada. The handwriting was neat and deliberate. Inside were 4 simple words. "I was the one." Charlie froze. His hands trembled as he read the signature, Franz Stigler. When Charlie called the number listed in the letter, his heart raced. The line clicked, and a warm, accented voice answered, "This is Franz." For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Charlie said quietly, "You saved us." On the other end, Franz replied, "And you made it home." They talked for hours, piecing together fragments of a memory that had haunted them both. Franz described everything: his squadron near Bremen, his damaged Messerschmitt, the sight of Ye Olde Pub limping across the sky, and the moment he saw the crew, broken, bleeding, refusing to give up. He told Charlie about his commander, Gustav Rodel, and the lesson that had defined his life: you fight with honor or you don't fight at all. Franz explained that he'd tried to get them to land in Germany, or at least in neutral Sweden, where they might get medical treatment. But when he saw Charlie's stubborn refusal, the determination in the young American's eyes, he understood. They would rather die flying home than live as prisoners. So Franz had chosen a different kind of courage. Not the kind that earned medals, but the kind that risked a firing squad. He escorted them past the anti-aircraft guns, through the air defenses, and saluted before disappearing. When Charlie heard this, he wept. For the first time in 47 years, the question that had consumed him finally had an answer. For Franz, the phone call meant just as much. He confessed he had always wondered if the bomber had made it home or crashed into the sea. "Now I can die happy," he said. "I know you lived." They spoke again the next day and the next. Within weeks, they were like brothers, separated by history but bound by a single moment of grace. 6 months later, in the summer of 1990, they agreed to meet in person in Seattle, Washington. The day was clear and bright, a gentle contrast to the gray skies of 1943. When Franz stepped out of the car and saw Charlie waiting, the years seemed to vanish. The two men walked toward each other, then broke into a run. Cameras rolled as they embraced like long-lost family. "I love you, Charlie," Franz whispered through tears. They spent hours together, recounting the missing decades. Charlie introduced Franz to his surviving crew members, men who owed their lives to him. Some cried as they shook his hand, others simply hugged him without words. That evening over dinner, Franz presented Charlie with a small book. Inside the cover, he had written, "In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother, Franz." Charlie kept that book until the day he died. Their reunion sparked something larger than friendship. It became a mission of its own, to show the world that even in the most brutal of wars, humanity can survive. Together, they began speaking publicly, traveling to air shows, schools, and veteran gatherings across North America. They told their story not as soldiers, but as men who had seen the best and worst of mankind. Wherever they went, audiences wept. Some people didn't understand. Franz received hate mail. Letters from those who called him a traitor for sparing an enemy. "You should have done your duty," one wrote. Franz's reply was simple: "I did." He had followed a higher duty, one to conscience, not command. For 18 years after their reunion, Charlie and Franz spoke almost every week. They spent holidays together, visited each other's families, and even traveled to the old airfields in Germany and England, where their lives had crossed paths. Their bond became a living example of redemption, proof that mercy could outlive hate. Charlie once said, "Meeting Franz cured me. The nightmares stopped. The war finally ended for me." For Franz, it was the same. It was the only good thing to come out of that war, he said. In their later years, both men slowed down but never stopped telling their story. They appeared on documentaries, spoke to historians, and even participated in the writing of the book A Higher Call, which would immortalize their story for generations to come. In one of his last interviews, Franz reflected on that December day in 1943. "When I saw that bomber, I saw no enemies, only men. We all wanted the same thing, to go home alive." That's all. Charlie often echoed that sentiment. If Franz had pulled the trigger, he said, 10 families would have grown up without fathers. My children, my grandchildren, they all exist because one man decided not to be my enemy. Time, as it always does, marched on. On March 22, 2008, Franz Stigler passed away in Vancouver at the age of 92. 8 months later, on November 24, 2008, Charlie Brown followed in Miami. He was 86. They were buried thousands of miles apart, one beneath the pines of Canada, the other under the warm sun of Florida. Yet their lives remain forever intertwined. their souls linked by that moment of mercy above Germany. When news of their deaths spread, veterans around the world shared their story again, of two men who had every reason to kill each other, but instead found brotherhood. To this day, their legacy endures as a quiet, powerful lesson. In a war that demanded hate, one man chose compassion. In a world divided by flags, two men saw beyond them. They proved that even in humanity's darkest hour, decency can still light the sky.